My name is Tewanee Joseph. My ancestral name is Tsutsaken. My birthday was February 5th, 1972, and I was born at Lionsgate Hospital in North Vancouver. My ancestral name Tsutsaken goes back 9 generations, and it didn't have a specific meaning, but it was a name that was passed on from generation to generation. But for me, when I received my ancestral name in the Longhouse, my late auntie, had picked this name because it was one name of 2 brothers, and I have a brother. So he carries Eauken, and I'm Tsutsaken. And she said that it goes back 9 generations the last time that people used it. So now, through oral traditions, but also through carrying on our culture, now it's my responsibility to carry on Tsutsaken through my son, which I passed it on to my 11-year-old son. So he carries that name Tsutsaken now. Away from lacrosse, I started a business in 2001, so I have a consulting firm that does major events, from Olympic Games to Rugby World Cups, and then we also specialize in communications and public relations, as well as putting together partnership agreements between First Nations and non-First Nations companies. My nickname in lacrosse was just the letter T. It was easy, and I knew that people trying to pronounce Tewanee was sometimes a little bit difficult sometimes, not so much today, but people always know me as T, and I always tell people, my friends call me T, so feel free to always refer to me that way. Well, for me, growing up in North Vancouver, I grew up on the reserve, Capilano Reserve in the Squamish Nation. Sport for me was all lacrosse. That's how we grew up. My first stick was a Mohawk stick, and I remember playing out in the backyard, and my cousins would be out there, and we had big dreams of watching our North Shore Indians, and we wanted to be them and watch all the greats, and so for us, that's really where the focus was. Now, being Maori, my father was a musician from New Zealand and met my mom, who was Indian Princess of Canada, and I always say out of my mom's love of music, I was born. But I grew up without my dad, and so for me, the sport and our culture, Squamish culture, was really prominent in who I am. And so what I grew up seeing was lacrosse, and I got to play rugby later on in the years, but being to New Zealand now a few times, there's a real passion. The same way we love lacrosse, they love rugby. Well, if you asked me that about 5 years ago, I'd love to do it, but now I think I'm a little bit older, and I'd have to warm up for about 20 minutes or so to be able to do the haka. For me, we're really lucky in our community because, we come from oral traditions, where we're storytellers in our community, and we used to have handball games. We really love and respect the Haudenosaunee people, and, being the cradle of lacrosse and the creator's game, we used to have handball games in our community. And so my great-grandfather was Andy Paul. He was the coach of the 1936 North Shore Indians. And we had Uncle Bunny, Stan Joseph Sr., and also cousins Ray Baker and Henry Hawkeye Breaker. And for us, we grew up hearing stories about them. And I used to see Stan actually when I was a young boy running around the lacrosse box and training, getting ready for whatever he was getting ready for. I just remember seeing him. To me, it stuck in my mind that if you want to play the game, you have to put in the time to be able to do it, but respect the game. And so those are the stories that I'd heard about Stan Joseph playing Jack Bionda, and his style was so different at the time, and even today it's hard to emulate. And so these would be the stories that we heard, and for my great-grandfather, he was not only involved in lacrosse, but in politics and fighting for our rights as peoples, but at the same time, he was very inclusive. He wanted us to be a part of Canada and the fabric, and that's really the North Shore Indians that I remember they were groundbreakers for us because they paved the way for our younger generations, but we're all connected in families to that particular team in 1936. In our culture, on the coast, we're longhouse people. So a lot of our customs and traditions where we lived as families were in these longhouses. And in the longhouses is a very communal living. And so you would eat together, you would sleep as families together, you would practice our cultures and traditions and ceremonies together. So that oral traditions really, it gets passed on from that part of our culture. But when you think about it, as we started to get into the 19th century, 20th century, and now in the 21st century, a lot of it's passed on, at the kitchen table. A lot of it's passed on and bringing young people with you to events and to games to be able to share the stories and the traditions of the game and the history of the game. For me, it's important, I have 2 young boys that play the game, and I tell them the stories that I had heard growing up. And so now it's their responsibility as people in our longhouse, when you come and witness our ceremony, you're now a witness carrier. You carry those messages and teachings from that day, and you pass it along, no matter where you're from or what culture you're from. you tell those stories over and over and over again, and that's how our oral traditions is kept alive. And that's how the stories of lacrosse and also our culture is kept alive, and that connection between the sport and who we are as a people. Yeah, when you think of a traditional lacrosse stick and you hold it and you feel it and you learn about it, there's a real connection that goes back centuries to how that stick was made. It's passed on from generation to generation. And I think what's important when you're talking about the sport of lacrosse, I hope that more young people and the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame and what they're doing in capturing stories, that's what we would do orally in our traditions in our community, but now it's done through video. And I think that's important for young people to learn that, but also as cultures, as we learn from each other, us as Indigenous peoples, to share those stories with young people that aren't Indigenous. And so they feel that connection that goes back for us, generations. Hopefully they'll feel that same connection to the lacrosse stars that weren't from our community, that we looked up to as well. They weren't Squamish and they weren't Indigenous, but those were our lacrosse heroes too. So we all have that same vision and that commonality amongst each other. So I hope that as we go forward, our young people start to not only hear the oral traditions, but we capture more video and hear the stories of those people that have come before us. Andy, being my great-grandfather, I heard the stories of what he used to do, and there used to be the Forum in Vancouver where lacrosse was played, and he was coaching, and my grandmother used to paint lacrosse balls white, and I heard stories not just from my family, but from people that weren't from our community that used to go to those games. Some elders that used to go and be there and feel the energy, and lacrosse was a big thing, and so for Andy, bringing that kind of exposure, but also what I believe that he stood for was having a vision. And when you have that vision and those objectives to do something, people will come along with you. And he translated that to politics. He translated it to music. And for me, I worked on my government for 8 years on council. And he was the first person for Squamish Nation Council in the early 1900s that was appointed to deal with the media. And lo and behold, later as a young fella, for me in the late 90s, I was in charge of the communications for our nation, and I've been lucky enough to know that what was possible, start a band, but it's a rock band instead of an orchestra. And I think that what Andy stood for was what's possible. If you really wanted to do something, you can go and take those values from lacrosse, I believe, and pass them on to anything in sport, but also in politics or business. Lacrosse to me, it's beyond a game. And as I grew up and I learned from those that came before me, those that were older, and our elders, is that I knew that there was a spiritual connection to the game, but also values that I could take from a sport and apply them to my life. And for me, as I started to learn from other coaches and watch other players, I was a student of the game from a young person and continue today. I always learn new things. And for me, that's what the sport really brought to my life. As I grew up playing the game, I was really interested to get to know people, and I hope that young people really try to get to know their teammates, get to know their coaches, and as one another, because you're coming together for this common goal, this common vision. And I think that the sport has allowed me to do that and take those teachings from the sport and work internationally on the Olympic Games, work on the Rugby World Cup, and work on other events. But also in business, in my business life, I take those same values and apply them to it. And they don't vary and they don't change, because in the sport you learn so much, and also with lacrosse is that you can expect the unexpected. You can plan the most as you want, but in that game there's this fluidity and beauty to the game, but also rhythm that you're trying to find. And when you find that rhythm, there's no feeling like it. And really that's what the sport has brought to my life that I try to pass on to my kids. Well, I remember playing with some of my colleagues, like Chris Gill and Rob Williams, and I remember mostly the times that we actually had conversations together. I do remember playing the game, but it's those times that we're traveling together on a plane. It was times that we were billeted out into people's homes that welcomed us. And with the Iroquois Nationals, I remember having conversations about the sport in our communities and seeing so many commonalities around that. But then we would go out and play Canada East and Canada West, and so it's mostly the times off the field that I remember most, because those connections, I still see those fellas today, and I still feel a connection to them, because when you're on that sport and you're giving everything and competing, that, you know, you carry those teachings and those memories together, but it's mostly the remembers, you know, in the locker room together. That's what I remember most, and it stands out in my mind. It was incredible to relive some of those times when we get together. Yeah, you know, lacrosse really is beyond just a game. Right? People think of a game, but the game has so many values intertwined into it that when you really think about it, when you're learning and practicing, you know, you set it, you have a vision. You know, this is what it is. You have goals that you set for yourself. You start to develop plans, and then you implement, and you execute, and you adjust. I really believe that, you know, lacrosse can teach you so much about life that when you translate that over into your business life, or if you're an artist, or if you're a doctor, you can take those same values, because when you sit together in a room with people from different cultures, you know, in a game that goes back generations and hundreds of years, that you have this spiritual connection of a healing game. And so when times of need, you can go back to the sport and play it, and that's what I love to play today, because when I'm not feeling quite right, I can go out onto the field or go onto the floor and play a game, and I come back and I feel, you know, I feel rejuvenated and better. And I think that's what the sport, you know, can be. And I hope that, you know, young people, as they're playing the game, there's a lot of X's and O's, there's a lot of skills that you develop, but at the same time, think about those values and the people around you. And that's what I took most from the game, and still to this day, that, you know, everybody is a connection to something. And if you can find those connections, they're going to come back around maybe 10 years, maybe 20, maybe 30 years later. It all comes back around, and this game is so closely tied to each other, and, you know, a real commonality amongst each other, and we support each other, and I think that's what the game stands for. What stands out of all the years that I've ever played, I remember watching my uncles and cousins play lacrosse, and they had their own sticks while they were playing out in the yard in Capilano Reserve. And I remember when I was handed from my cousin, who was taking care of many of our young kids in our community and supporting them, he handed me my first Mohawk lacrosse stick, and it was mine. And so when I had that and I grabbed a ball and I went to the side of the house and started throwing it against the wall, I could not believe that I had my own lacrosse stick. And to me, that amongst anything was the biggest thrill, and I can even go back in this moment and remember what it felt like to be able to hold this stick in my hand and know that it was part of me now, and you take care of it, and that's what I was taught. And so, you know, all the thrills that I've had over the years, I'm chasing that feeling, right? And when you hit it right, whether it's winning a national championship or whether you've played well in a game, that moment is the moment that I always chase, because I can feel it in my heart, I can feel it in my body, and that's the thrill of the game that I'll never forget. Well, you know, I think the one thing about the game that I wish that I had done more of is actually Senior B to us growing up in the Squamish Nation was it. Like, it was, we saw our families all playing Senior B lacrosse, and when you look across the country, you know, when you look into Six Nations at that time, or Akwesasne or Ganawagi or Tyendinaga, you know, Senior B was really big because we had some of their players come play with our players, with our Squamish. Some of our Squamish players go play, you know, back east. But I wish that I had played more summer WLA, you know, because to me, you know, we had the best lacrosse players out here, and when you look across Canada and playing against Ontario, I wish I played more of that, because I did spend a lot of time connecting in our community, and that was our place to come together as a community. One thing we could agree on was lacrosse. So although I did play enough that I enjoyed playing in the playoffs and those kinds of things, I think that's one thing to go back that when I teach my kids, is that, you know what, go play, because when you can play here, you can play there, you can always come home. And I think that's, for me at the time, was we were trying to keep that connection to our culture alive, which I love. But at the same time, we need more of our kids to get outside of our community and go play not only WLA or NLL, play university. And I think that's part of now, you know, the responsibility that I would have to carry on to my kids, to say, go do it, go play. Because when you do that, you're going to meet people and you're going to connect with the game, and you'll find those different places and different challenges in life that you need to overcome. So for me, that's what I think about more of as I look back over my career. Having been around the Olympic Games and the International Olympic Committee and meeting many of the athletes, both in the Olympics and Paralympics, lacrosse needs to be at the Olympic Games. And I do believe that the athletes that we have that can share this beautiful game in the Olympics with the world, I think people will come to understand that, you know, when you talk about the game of lacrosse, it has this connection that goes back so many years and so many generations, that the more people see it, the more they'll feel excited about it, and the more that our players that play the game are going to be able to ascend to a world level. And I believe that's where lacrosse is going, and that's where it should be, and that's where we will be in the next 10 years.